Brother, can you spare a dime for America's breadbasket? Hi, this is Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle now. And Bill, I've been sitting on this story for a couple of days that it was just surprised me, this statistic, according to Axios.com, and this is taking information from the Department of Agriculture at the federal level, that some 40% of 2019 farm income came from the following sources: trade aid, disaster assistance, farm subsidies, and insurance. 40% essentially was something other than the sale of the product produced on the farm. It was either government subsidies or insurance claims. Bill, bankruptcies among farms and fisheries, which are kind of fish farms, are up 24% in the past year. It's the highest since 2011, although it's well below the 1980s level. I have a couple of questions specifically about this. And number one is just from the perspective of feeding America, of the domestic food production, what concerns do you have when you look at 40% of farmers' income coming essentially not from farming?
I have no concern whatsoever about the American farmers' ability to feed the American people. I think if you left them alone, they could feed the entire planet, and they have been doing so for 50 years. But in terms of the food supply for the United States, that is the bottom of the list of things that I worry about.
Well, as long as the money keeps flowing, isn't that true, Bill? Because part of this, by the way, and let me throw this in here because this was the genesis of the story. The farm aid that the Trump administration put in place as to begin to ameliorate some of the negative effects of the trade dispute with China has been some $28 billion, or twice as much as the 2009 Detroit auto bailout from the federal government.
Well, first of all, can you please just reread for me the four sources you mentioned that consist of 40% of the farm revenue?
Sure. That is trade aid, and I assume they're referring there to the money that the Trump administration has made available because of the China trade dispute. Disaster assistance. So this is when something happens.
Yeah, I know what they mean.
And subsidies. They just said the farm bill, but generally farm subsidies where we're propping up the prices of
and insurance
of commodities, and then insurance indemnities.
Okay.
Yes.
So let's just take a look at these one by one. First of all, I think we can all agree that insurance is off the table, right? You have insurance for a reason. You're paying for insurance. If insurance amounted to a significant amount of claims on a farm, that's no different than insurance being a major part of your income in terms of your health insurance or your car insurance. So if I think we could take insurance payouts off of this particular list with some confidence, because that's a private transaction. It's got nothing to do with government agencies or aid or so on. I think we can also make a pretty strong case for disaster relief. Disaster relief does not apply just to farmers. It's something that the federal government does, and I think it's an appropriate use of federal money, one of the few appropriate uses of federal money when some gigantic hurricane comes through and wipes out 4 states. I think that if you're going to spend federal money, that's worthwhile spending it on, which leaves us with two: foreign assistance for foreign trade, and then just general subsidies. I've said before that if the president imposes a policy of punitive sanctions against China to make China play fair, and that impacts the farming community, I think that the federal government does have some kind of an obligation to the farming community, because they have changed the rules of the game. They've changed the market is what they've done. The government has gone in and changed the market without the consent of the farmers. And to the degree that they'd be compensated for that, that also doesn't strike me as a particularly onerous thing, which leaves us with farm subsidies. That's really it. Now, I don't know what percentage of the 40% farm subsidies are, but farm subsidies are, I think, the issue. And I have a very imperfect knowledge about this, but generally speaking, when the government pays you not to grow something, which has been the case of some subsidies, I'm not saying all, then you know you've got a problem. You know that there's something fundamentally wrong with this system. And one of the most egregious violations of the Constitution and the use of the Commerce Clause to violate the Constitution was when this farmer was told that he was not allowed to grow food for his own animals on his own farm. I forget what the case was, but basically, the Congress said that we can use the Commerce Clause to make sure that you can't grow food for your own animals because we have all these prices fixed. Anytime you have the government involved with business and you are dealing with anything that coercively affects the market in terms of legislation, taxation, all of import tariffs, all of it, you're messing around. And I don't think it's fair for American farmers to have to pay the burden of being held responsible to a system where they are not free to do what they want to in terms of the market.
Well, Bill, it's one thing to say that the federal government should step in the case of a natural disaster, so to speak, an act of God, that the federal government had nothing to do with creating. And by the way, the case you reference is Wickard versus Filburn, where the Supreme Court decided that when a guy fed some of his crop to his own chickens, that he was somehow extracting it from the marketplace and therefore affecting commerce, interstate commerce, by depriving the interstate commerce network of that product, and that he couldn't do that. So, but
that particular ruling, just real quick, that particular ruling is notable for two reasons. It is notable because on the macro scale, it is the largest, clearest example of how the federal government overstepped its authority and used a clause that was in there for decoration, basically, in order to create laws that were never intended. And any reading of the Commerce Clause says that this was never intended to be on the top scale. It's also interesting on the bottom scale because it's hard to imagine a more intrusive argument than the government saying you cannot grow food for your own animals on your own farm. But please
it
continue.
helped to keep Obamacare in place.
Well, then there you go. There's your answer.
Because you can't not buy something.
No.
So here's the problem with that, though, Bill. We're talking not about a natural phenomenon. We're talking about a man-caused issue. In this case, President Trump's particular approach to Chinese trade negotiations. And it goes further than this. And
that's not disaster relief, though.
The subsidies that they're paying to farmers, this trade aid to make up for the losses that they're suffering because China retaliated against the Trump administration's actions as well anyone could expect. Not only could you make the case that the Trump administration caused a problem and then is taking taxpayer money to help some people in the country get through the problem, but also, let me give you an example of Iowa farmers. The aid that they received from the federal government came to some $973 million. Unfortunately, their losses came to $1.7 billion. So not only did Trump create the problem and try to take taxpayer money to pay off the people who are being affected by it, but it's not enough money to really compensate them for their losses.
Well, let's look at this one by one. As I said, I don't think at this point I have to make an enormous amount of backpedaling to prove my bona fides on how much I despise federal interference with commerce in the market, and I think subsidies of virtually any kind are not just bad for the taxpayer. I think they're bad for the people receiving the subsidies. Every single case in the history of the United States, and I'm not talking about individual cases or even individual companies. I'm talking about entire sectors of the economy. Subsidized railroads were not nearly as good or as effective as privately built railroads. Subsidized steam lines were not as good as the private steam lines. And so we don't need to make that case again. So generally speaking, I think subsidies are a problem. And I wonder why they're there in the first place. American farmers are certainly the most efficient in the world, and they continue to become more so every day. They are not just the ultimate security source of the United States. When you get right down to it, the ultimate security of the people consists of, can you defend them from foreign invasion and can you feed them? And so farmers have and deserve, in my opinion, a particularly important place, in fact, the most important place, up there with the military in terms of our debt that we owe them. Now, when we talk about, as we said, if the president makes a policy that makes a foreign policy decision that he decides is in the best interest of the United States, and I think so too, certainly, getting China to play fair by making it hurt is in the long-term interest of the United States, no question in my mind. So while I'm against tariffs, punitive tariffs against a specific individual player who is cheating is about the only thing you can do, and we're already starting to see some pretty big gains from this. But if I make an executive decision, and all of a sudden I have doubled the cost of a sector's products. Those people on the farms are not responsible for that. They didn't make the mistake. They're not the ones who implemented the policy. It is being imposed upon them by the federal government legally, and in terms of the Chinese retaliating through the retaliatory tariffs. And so we have an obligation to the people who we've affected by our political decision. Now, in the case of this specific case, I'm on board with it pretty much 100%. I think China does need to be punished for its cheating. I think China has done enormous damage, not only to our economy, but to the world economy through just plain cheating. And if you have to if making China play fair means hurting American farmers, then it's in the interest of the United States to compensate those farmers long-term for the gains that we're going to receive downstream. So none of that I have a problem with. It's the specific subsidies on specific crops that I really have an issue with. And the only reason I have an issue with it is because anything that is affecting the market is bad. When I say affecting it, I mean coercing it, legally coercing it. Look, people on the left talk about the market. Oh, you have this mystical belief in the market, like the market's some kind of mystical thing. There's nothing mystical about it at all, nothing. The market is very simple. The market has a wisdom of its own. In fact, it has ultimate wisdom because all the market is 300 million people making their own decisions. There's nothing tyrannical about the market. There's nothing enforced about the market. There's nothing ideological about the market. You have market forces at work in communist China in 1950. So anytime
Are
somebody
you saying
starts
the market is people, Bill?
I'm saying the market is people, Scott. It's people. The market is people.
Let me just finish this episode with this one little note
here.
The
market is choice.
And you can react to it, but react quickly because I got to go eat some American grain and cheese. It's lunchtime for me.
Do you have any legumes?
So Axios also noted, and somewhat surprisingly to the people at Axios.com, that in September, according to recent polling of farmers, that Trump's support from farmers is up from 60% last year to 67% this year. Do you think this is just because they like their sugar daddy in Washington, even if he's not providing enough sugar? Or is there some other explanation for their unflagging and, in fact, blossoming support of the president?
I would imagine that his cutting of taxes across the board didn't hurt anybody. The number I've heard, I'm within a couple $100 on this, was that personal income per family rose like $1,400 under 8 years of Obama, but it's $5,400 under 3 years of Trump. That would make him popular with just about anybody, and it's going to make him popular with blue-collar workers in those states that we kind of just narrowly won. I think in 2016, I think they're going to be much more solid wins for President Trump. But I think that the farmer, and this is the other half of the thing I didn't quite completely flesh out as much as I wanted to. I personally believe that the foundational values of America exist in the hearts of farmers. And I don't think there's much discussion about that in terms of at least the theory of the founding. Thomas Jefferson, who was so influential, and everybody else. When we formed this government, it was a government of individual farmers, basically. That was who this government was designed for. Leave us alone. We'll leave you alone. The government may perhaps be able to put some money into ports or maybe building a road from one place to another, but other than that, just kind of leave us alone. And that's worked very well. And there is something about farming, and I'm talking about personal farming now, small-scale farming, that doesn't just protect the values of this country; they generate them. That's where I'm trying to go. There's something about getting up at 4:00 in the morning, to milk the cows, that is essentially the entire American idea. This is my cow. And I'm going to have to get up at 4:00 in the morning. And it's miserable getting up at 4:00 in the morning in the winter. And it's miserable having to do it your entire life. But because it is my cow and because those are my crops out there, I'm willing to do it if for no other reason than to feed my family and to have my own house and my own property and not be dependent on somebody thousands of miles away. So I have undying respect for farmers, and I have undying respect for the values that are generated from working on a farm. And among many others, you could put the whole spectrum of American values down on a farm. But among the first one that flew to my mind was that on a farm, children become adults at a very reasonable pace, but also in a very appropriate order. In other words, the children on a family farm are part of the workforce, and it's not like, it's not uncommon to see the 12-year-old, probably 8-year-olds driving tractors. That's appropriate. The father has spent plenty of time with that son, knows the son knows how to handle it, took plenty of time with him. Now the kid's out there, 16, 14, whatever, driving a tractor. Okay, and this is how adults are supposed to be. And at the same time, because of its remoteness and because of its isolation, and because of the connections between your farm and other farmers, you expose children to appropriate adult values earlier than they would in these insane cities. And you also protect them from so much of the vice that children aren't prepared to handle. And so this country is a country founded on farm values, hard work, free enterprise, families, religion, and neighborliness as opposed to community. That's a profoundly different concept. Community, certainly as it's being employed today, is a series of obligations. It's a series of obligations and a series of standards and laws and restrictions that apply equally to everybody. Neighborliness, on the other hand, has no legal enforcement whatsoever. If somebody's barn is on fire, you're not obligated by law to go over and help them put out the fire. What would motivate you to go and help put out another farmer's fire is the fact that your farm may catch fire someday. And so the whole thing becomes a giant web of trust and investment and compassion and love and all the rest of it. And all of these values are important. So if farmers are being hurt by federal trade policy, then I think they need to be compensated. Farmers who are getting money from insurance because they paid insurance premiums, there's nothing terrible or unique about that. Natural disasters in terms of a flood or something that may wipe out thousands or millions of acres of farmland, again, these are reasonable expenditures for the federal government. And that only leaves us with subsidies in terms of the federal government deciding what you can and cannot grow based on somebody's idea of the market. And those things have to go.
Well, as a kid who worked on a hog farm, let me just say you did leave out one value, the value of bacon. I'll also say that when farmers help other farmers, I don't believe there's any kind of transactional calculation.
No, there isn't.
If Bill's barn is on fire, then Scott goes over to help him put out the fire because
it's the right thing to do.
Bill's barn's on fire.
That's precisely correct. But that ethic is the underlying ethic is built into the idea that voluntary cooperation benefits everybody, and that affinity. In other words, I don't have to go because my barn may catch fire someday. If Bill's barn's on fire, I'm going to help put the fire out. That affinity, that willingness to get up at 3 a.m. and risk your life on top of it, is based on the fact that as an individual and as Bill is an individual, two people can get together and they leave each other alone and they help each other when they're needed. I mean, that's how it's supposed to work. What you do is none of my business. If you're in trouble, I will help you. If I get in trouble, it'd be nice if you help me. But other than that, it's nice to see you down at church on Sunday or see you in the barbershop or whatever every 3 or 4 days. And off you go. You got a country there.
Ladies and gentlemen, the members at BillWhittle.com are such people. They help each other. They help with this enterprise and make it possible for this message of solid American values to spread not just across the country, but around the world. We're grateful for their voluntary cooperation in this effort and the knowledge that most of them do it not because they think they're really going to get anything out of it other than the satisfaction of knowing that they're advancing this kind of conversation beyond just their little family and circle circle of friends. So if you'd like to become a member at BillWhittle.com, just go to BillWhittle.com and click that Become a Member link. You can also listen to our podcast now, pretty much anywhere you can listen to podcasts. If you have any questions about that, click the contact link at BillWhittle.com and we'll get you hooked up. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members for making this happen.